The river moved fast with the thaw, swollen with snowmelt from the high country. Elias McGraw walked its edge at dusk, his boots pressing deep into the softened earth, his hat pulled low against the sharp spring wind. The air smelled of silt and pine resin carried down from the mountains. He had come to clear his thoughts, though thoughts had been his only company for years now. The water hissed against the rocks, a steady voice that seemed older than grief. Then he saw her. At first, it was only a flash of color, cloth caught on a current, a pale hand breaking the surface. The river had her, dragging her head under, spinning her like driftwood. Elias dropped his coat where he stood and waded in without a word, boots filling with icy weight. The shock of it cut into his bones, but he pressed forward, pushing through the pull of the current until he caught her arm. She struggled once, weakly, before her body sagged against his. He dragged her up the bank, water sheeting off both of them, his breath coming ragged. She was young, scarcely more than a girl, her braids heavy with river silt, a torn shawl clinging to her shoulders. Her lips were blue, her lashes rimmed with grit. Elias gathered her up, uncertain, his chest tight with something more than the cold. He did not think, only carried her back the mile toward the ranch, his boots leaving deep prints in the darkening mud. The cabin greeted him with silence, the way it always did. He laid her near the hearth and fed kindling into the coals until flames leapt again, casting their restless light across the room. Steam rose from her shawl, the smell of river water filling the space. She stirred faintly, coughing, but her eyes did not open. Elias sat back on his heels, dripping, and wondered what he had done. He knew well enough what neighbors would say if they saw her here. To them, an Apache girl under his roof would mean scandal at best, suspicion at worst. Yet he could not bring himself to leave her outside in the night air, not with the frost still biting. So he draped a blanket across her, sat in the rocking chair his late wife had once favored, and listened to its creak mark the hours. Sometime past midnight, she opened her eyes. Dark, unblinking, they fixed on him without wavering. She did not speak, did not flinch. She only drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and remained curled near the fire. Elias met her gaze for a time, but words felt heavy and unfit. He turned his eyes instead to the flames, to the way they bent and reached as though always hungry. The night stretched long. He dozed fitfully in the chair, waking each time the fire settled low, adding another log to keep the warmth alive. She did not move except to follow the flicker of light with her eyes. No thanks, no explanation, but none had been asked for. The silence between them was taut, filled with mistrust and something deeper he could not yet name. When dawn came pale and cold across the plains, Elias rose stiffly and stepped outside. Frost silvered the grass, the air sharp in his lungs. He thought, perhaps, she would slip away while he fetched water from the pump, vanish as suddenly as she had come. But when he returned, there she was still, seated where he had left her, eyes steady upon him like a shadow that refused to break. And in that moment, Elias understood. By pulling her from the river, he had pulled something else into his life, something he had not asked for and could not easily cast off. The days that followed moved with a quiet strangeness. Wherever Elias went, the girl was never far behind. He would step out with a pail for water, and she would trail him, bare feet whispering in the frost-hardened grass. When he mended the sagging fence line, she lingered just beyond his reach, watching the swing of the hammer as though memorizing its rhythm. If he chopped wood, she stood still among the scattered chips, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the axe. She never spoke, not in words he could understand, but her silence was not empty. It pressed against him, constant, unsettling. At first, Elias tried to ignore it, willing her to drift off on her own accord. But she did not. She remained like a shadow stitched to his every step. Her presence stirred the past in ways he had long kept buried. He would glance up from his work and see her braids swinging, damp from the river yet slowly drying, and memory would strike like a blow. His wife standing by the stove, humming low while her shawl slipped from her shoulders, laughter rising like warm smoke in the rafters. That same shawl lay folded still in a cedar trunk, untouched since the day he closed it away. Each time he noticed the Apache girl's shawl, torn, water-stained, clinging to her withered frame, his chest ached with the sharpness of contrast. The girl bore her own scars. Elias saw them when she reached for a piece of firewood, thin white lines across her forearm, like marks left by brambles or knives. He did not ask. She did not offer. Yet those scars unsettled him more than her silence, for they spoke of a life beaten into shape by hands far crueler than his. One evening, as the sky bruised with thunder, he brought the horses in early. The wind hissed across the plains, rattling the boards of the barn. Inside the cabin, the fire spit sparks against the iron. The girl sat huddled by the flames, her knees drawn close, the storm reflected in her wide eyes. Elias rocked in his chair, the creak of it filling the silence until he almost thought it a voice. Then she spoke. Her words were few, halting, broken by a tongue not her own. "They left me," she whispered, the syllables rough as if torn from her throat. For a long moment, Elias did not move. The rocking chair slowed, its rhythm breaking. He studied her in the shifting glow, the dark braid that had come loose, strands frayed like rope worn thin. In those 3 words, he heard more than he wished to. He heard his own loss echoed, his wife buried on a hill beneath the cedar cross he had carved, his neighbors pulling away from him once his grief had hardened into solitude. Both of them left behind. Both of them marked by absence. The storm rattled the shutters, rain streaking down the window glass. Elias felt something shift in that silence, fragile but undeniable, like a thread drawn between 2 people who had no business finding kinship and yet did. He did not answer her confession, for he had no words to give. Instead, he rose, added another log to the fire, and set her shawl closer to the heat so that it would dry by morning. As the flames leapt higher, she watched him with an expression he could not name, not gratitude, not trust, but something softer, tentative, as though she were weighing whether the world might not abandon her twice. Elias turned away, his heart heavier and yet, strangely, less alone. The first snow came sudden, drifting down like ash from a pale sky. Elias was in the yard, mending a broken hinge on the barn door, when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the stillness. He looked up to see a rider cresting the rise, coat dark against the falling flakes. The man swung down from his horse with the practiced ease of one used to long roads. Elias recognized him, though the years had lined his face and added a stiffness to his gait. A settler from town, a man who had shared a whiskey or 2 with him back when Elias still kept company. The man's eyes slid past Elias to the figure moving quietly near the barn. Nayeli carried a bundle of wood in her arms, her braid trailing damp down her back. For a moment, the stranger's jaw tightened. He spat into the snow, then turned a hard gaze on Elias. "You know what folks will say. Apache under your roof. That'll bring nothing but ruin. Mark my words." Elias said nothing. He only held the man's stare until the silence grew sharp. When the visitor finally mounted again and rode off, the falling snow swallowed the sound of his horse. Elias went inside, his hand brushing the stock of the rifle that hung above the hearth. The wood was worn smooth where his fingers had gripped it countless times, and tonight he gripped it tighter still. By nightfall, the storm arrived. Wind screamed across the plains, slamming into the cabin with the fury of 100 fists. Elias and Nayeli moved together in the dark yard, the lantern's glow catching on the snow that lashed their faces. She struggled against the gusts, but did not falter, helping him haul firewood under cover and throw extra blankets over the horses. Her small frame bent against the storm, stubborn as any ranch hand Elias had ever known. When at last they tumbled inside, soaked and breathless, the cabin groaned with the weight of the wind. The fire hissed, embers scattered by the draught. Elias dropped the armload of wood by the hearth. Nayeli crouched near the flames, shivering, water dripping from the fringe of her torn shawl. For a long while, only the roar of the storm filled the space. Then, haltingly, she spoke. Her English was rough, broken, but Elias caught the words between the stumbles. Raiders had struck her village. She had fled into the river, into exile. Her own people had turned away, calling her cursed, a bearer of misfortune. Her voice cracked with shame, and she drew her knees close, as though bracing against an unseen blow. Elias watched her, something in his chest tightening. The firelight caught the sheen of water on her cheek, whether from storm or tears he could not tell. She trembled, but it was not the cold alone. He felt the weight of her solitude, heavy as his own, and for the first time in many years, he reached beyond it. He crossed the room and opened the cedar trunk where his late wife's belongings lay folded, untouched. From within he drew the shawl, soft with age, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. He paused, staring at the fabric that had once warmed another life, then carried it to the girl. Without a word, he draped it across her shoulders. Nayeli's hands rose slowly, touching the shawl as though it were sacred. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and unguarded. She did not thank him, but none was needed. The silence between them was enough, deep and trembling as the storm outside. Elias stood there, the fire casting restless shadows across his face. He knew, then, that what had begun at the river was no accident. Protection was no longer a choice, but a vow, spoken in quiet deeds rather than words. And as the storm raged against the roof, something fragile and unspoken settled between them, holding fast where the world beyond could not. The weeks stretched on, and the shape of Elias's life began to bend in ways he had not asked for. At first, it was only the eyes of others that pressed upon him. When he rode into town for flour, salt, or nails, men at the mercantile looked past him and then back again, their talk dipping into low murmurs. Women at the well gathered their shawls tighter, whispering behind their hands as if he carried some contagion. The barkeep, once quick to share a word, now only nodded stiffly and kept polishing his glass. Elias endured it with the same silence he had given every sorrow these last years, but it stung nonetheless. Back at the ranch, the air inside the cabin grew heavy with unspoken things. Nayeli moved with quiet purpose, her eyes watchful, her presence constant. Elias could not decide if she unsettled him or steadied him. One evening, walking past the barn, he saw her seated on an overturned bucket, a length of rope in her lap. Her fingers worked steadily, braiding the strands with a patience that seemed older than her years. She did not look away when his shadow crossed her, but held his gaze, testing, as though she wished to see if he would break like others had, those who had abandoned her to the river, to silence, to storms. Chores once left for Elias alone began to fall into her hands. She carried pails, mended torn feed sacks, brought wood in before the frost set deep. In the mornings, coffee already simmered before he opened his eyes. The fire never dwindled to cold ashes. The ranch, which had become little more than a husk of duty since his wife's passing, began to breathe again, though Elias would not admit it aloud. Still, guilt rode him like a second shadow. Each time the aroma of coffee met him at dawn, he remembered another pair of hands, his wife's hands, small and sure, turning the millstone, laughing at some half-forgotten jest. He saw her shawl folded away, now draped over Nayeli's shoulders. The fire's glow made it easy to mistake one life for another, if he let his eyes blur. And with each reminder came the ache of betrayal, as though to accept this girl's help, her presence, was to erase what had once been sacred. One night, weariness loosened his tongue. He sat by the fire, elbows heavy on his knees, and said low, "You cannot stay here forever." The words hung in the air, brittle, carrying more weight than he intended. Nayeli froze. Her hand stilled on the shawl's fringe, her eyes lifting slowly to his. For a moment, he thought she would leave then and there, vanish into the night as silently as she had come. Instead, she whispered, her English broken but clear enough, "If you tell me go, I go." Her voice trembled, though her back was straight, her chin lifted with a kind of quiet pride. Yet in her eyes was something rawer, a loneliness he knew too well. They glistened in the firelight, reflecting not only her sorrow but his own. Elias had no answer. His throat closed against words he did not yet know how to speak. He only leaned back in the rocking chair, its slow creak carrying through the room, while the fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grass, whispering against the walls, but inside there was only the weight of two silences, bound together by what neither could bring themselves to say. The sound of riders came before the dust rose, the rhythm of hooves cutting through the late afternoon stillness. Elias had been at the table, mending a harness with thread thick as twine, when he heard it. He stood, slow but steady, and the rocking chair creaked once behind him as it tilted back from his leaving. By the time he stepped onto the porch, the men were already fanning out across the yard. The stranger from town led them, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Rifles glinted in the pale light, a quiet menace in the hands that carried them. "McGraw," the man called, his voice edged with certainty, "you've got something doesn't belong to you. Word is she's tied to raids. Blood spilled out on the flats. You'll hand her over." Elias's hand rested on the rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. His eyes swept the men, faces flushed with conviction, or fear turned to anger. He gave no reply, only stood there, the doorframe at his back. Inside, Nayeli had risen from her place near the fire. She stepped forward into the doorway, her shoulders squared though her face was pale. Elias felt her presence behind him like the press of a shadow. She spoke softly, in words halting but clear enough, "I go. I bring ruin." Her hand moved as if to reach for the latch, but Elias shifted, barring the way with the breadth of his frame. His voice came low, steady, carrying a weight the wind could not shake. "No one crosses this threshold tonight." The yard stilled. The horses stamped, restless, tails lashing at the swarming flies. Dust swirled in small eddies around the boots of the riders. Far off, thunder muttered along the horizon. For a time that stretched thin, no one moved. The men shifted their grips on the rifles, casting uneasy glances at one another. The stranger's mouth tightened, his jaw working as if grinding down the urge to push forward. But Elias's eyes did not falter, nor did the rifle in his hands. He looked like a man carved from the very land he stood upon, immovable, unwilling. At last, the stranger spat into the dirt. "You'll regret this." He jerked his reins, and the others followed. One by one, they turned their horses, muttering curses as they rode off into the gathering storm. The thunder grew louder as they vanished into the dust. Elias closed the door behind him, the weight of the latch sliding home. Inside, the fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls, restless and alive. Nayeli stood in the quiet, her hands trembling at her sides. Slowly, she reached up and drew the shawl from her shoulders. Crossing the room, she laid it gently across his lap where he had sunk into the chair once more. The gesture was deliberate, as though she were returning something sacred, something not hers to keep. Elias looked down at the fabric, worn soft by years and touched now by new hands. He did not speak. Instead, he lifted it and placed it back around her shoulders, firm, as though to say it belonged where it was. Her eyes shone in the firelight, but she made no sound. The silence between them held, deeper now, heavier with something that had no name. They sat there together, the storm outside rolling across the plains, the fire breathing steadily between them. No vow was spoken, but Elias knew it as surely as if it had been carved into stone. His life was no longer his alone to weather. They came at dawn, when the air was thin and the grass still silvered with frost. Elias heard them before he saw them, the dull thud of hooves, the rattle of tack, the murmur of men who believed they carried justice at their backs. He stepped outside, the cold biting deep into his lungs, and stood on the porch with his rifle resting easy in his hands. Across the yard, the riders drew up in a ragged line. Faces he knew, men he had traded with, shared silence with at funerals, nodded to across narrow streets. Now their eyes were hard, their mouths tight with judgment. The stranger from before sat among them, his jaw set like iron. "McGraw," he called, "enough of this. We'll not let her bring more blood upon us. Hand her over. It ends here." Behind Elias, the cabin door creaked, and he felt Nayeli's presence like a shadow at his back. He did not turn. Instead, he let the silence hang until the horses stamped restlessly, the men shifting in their saddles. Then his voice came, low but clear. "She has harmed no one here. Not one of you can speak otherwise." His eyes swept across them, steady as stone. "This land has taken more from me than you'll ever know. What stands under my roof is mine to guard. If you turn her out, if you stain her name with your fear, it won't wash clean. Not for you, not for this town." The men stirred, unease whispering through them. A few shifted their rifles, but none raised them. The weight of his words pressed harder than the barrel of a gun. They saw it in him, a man who had already lost everything that could be taken, who stood now with nothing but his resolve. For a long moment, the cold air held their anger. Then, slowly, it broke. One rider wheeled his horse, muttering under his breath. Another spat into the frost. One by one, they turned away, the line unraveling as it had been woven. The stranger lingered longest, his glare fixed on Elias like a blade. But even he lowered his eyes at last, tugging his reins, vanishing into the pale light of morning. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, Elias lowered the rifle. Nayeli stood in the doorway, her face unreadable, her hands clutching the shawl at her shoulders. For the first time in many years, he felt the silence of the ranch was not empty, but shared. Later that day, he saddled his horse. Nayeli climbed up behind him, light as a shadow, and together they rode back to the river. The water ran calmer now, the current gentled after its violence. Elias reined in and sat staring at the place where he had pulled her from the dark depths weeks before. He spoke softly, his voice carrying more weight than if he had shouted. "Here's where it began. You're free to choose, girl. Stay if you will. Go if your heart tells you. The choice is yours, not mine." For a long while, only the murmur of water filled the stillness. Then Nayeli's hand reached forward, resting over his on the reins. No words, no oath, only the quiet firmness of her touch. She had chosen. Elias nodded once, almost to himself, and turned the horse homeward. They rode in silence, the river fading behind them, the plain stretching wide and open before them. Not rescuer and shadow, not burden and bearer, but two souls who had outlasted abandonment, who had found in each other not salvation, but dignity. The cabin waited, small against the horizon, smoke curling from its chimney. And for the first time in years, Elias felt the road behind him grow lighter, the road ahead less lonely.